Hormuz has gone quiet. The Gulf is holding its breath, and the price of energy is about to find out how much fear is left in the system. Right now, the most valuable commodity isn't crude oil by itself. It's confidence. Confidence that ships will move, confidence that ports will work, confidence that schedules will hold, and confidence that the world's biggest energy choke point will behave like a highway instead of a battlefield. Because when the Strait of Hormuz stops feeling routine, nothing stays routine. This isn't a story about one country. It's a story about one narrow strip of water that the modern world built an entire lifestyle around. In normal conditions, roughly 20 million barrels of oil and petroleum products pass through Hormuz every day. That's not a lot. That's the bloodstream of trade. Add liquefied natural gas, and you're talking about power plants, heating systems, and industrial supply chains that depend on a predictable flow across a map most people can't even point to. So when warnings start circulating, when insurers start recalculating, when shipping firms start pausing, the economy doesn't wait for an official press conference. It reacts to the risk. Here's what closed often means in practice. It means captains receiving urgent advisories on maritime channels. It means tankers drifting and anchoring in holding areas instead of committing to a transit window. It means war risk premiums rising so sharply that a voyage that made sense yesterday suddenly looks like a financial gamble today. It means charterers hesitating, ports tightening, security, and crews wondering whether they're sailing into a corridor that might change in minutes. And when enough vessels hesitate at the same time, you get something the oil market understands instantly: a visible traffic jam made of billions of dollars. Each tanker is a moving warehouse. Each LNG carrier is an entire winter's worth of heat for someone, somewhere. When those warehouses stop moving, the world doesn't just lose supply. It loses timing. And timing is what keeps prices calm. That's why the first phase of a Hormuz crisis is often a pricing shock before it becomes a physical shortage. Traders don't need empty tanks to panic. They only need uncertainty that grows faster than the ability to verify it. Now let's put the geography in plain language. Hormuz is a gate at the mouth of the Persian Gulf, bordered by Iran to the north and Oman to the south. It's narrow enough that traffic is funneled into specific lanes. That's efficient when it's peaceful. It's terrifying when it's contested. Because a narrow lane means disruption can be psychological. You don't have to sink every ship. You only have to make enough ships afraid that the lane becomes unreliable. And unreliability is the enemy of everything that runs on just-in-time. Oil doesn't just power cars, it powers the cost of moving anything. Diesel drives trucks, fuel powers container ships, petrochemicals feed plastics, natural gas supports electricity and fertilizer. Every modern supply chain has energy baked into it, like an invisible tax on reality. So when oil spikes, it doesn't stay in the energy section of the newspaper. It shows up in grocery receipts, airline tickets, construction costs, and the price of borrowing money. That last point matters more than most people realize. Central banks can handle many kinds of inflation. They can fight demand. They can adjust rates. They can cool an overheated economy. But an energy shock is a different animal because it pushes prices up while squeezing growth. It forces policymakers into ugly choices: tighten and risk recession, or ease and risk inflation becoming permanent. That's how a maritime crisis turns into a political crisis. And it's happening in a world that doesn't have much slack. Households are already stretched. Governments are already carrying heavy debt. Many economies are already sensitive to interest rates. A sudden, sustained rise in energy costs is the kind of pressure that finds every weak joint in the system. Now add the military layer, because this is where the stakes become personal. In a Gulf escalation, there are two strategic truths that collide. First, Iran's historical leverage is tied to its ability to threaten movement through the Gulf. It doesn't need to match the United States ship for ship to create fear. It only needs tools that make transit uncertain: coastal missiles, drones, mines, small fast boats, surveillance, and the ability to strike at moments that keep everyone guessing. Second, the United States and its partners have a core interest in preventing maritime coercion from becoming a successful strategy. If a choke point like Hormuz can be closed or effectively disrupted, it becomes a precedent. And once it becomes a precedent, other corridors around the world start to look like pressure points too. So the response when it comes tends to be direct. Not a symbolic gesture, a mission aimed at removing the ability to disrupt. That means targeting launch sites, boats, command nodes, and the infrastructure that supports the threat. It means striking the tools, not just the rhetoric. And as soon as that happens, the conflict expands beyond the water. Because once you start removing leverage, the other side faces a brutal decision: de-escalate and look weak, or escalate and risk losing more. That's why information warfare explodes in parallel. In the early hours of a crisis like this, you'll see dramatic claims racing across social media. Ships hit, carriers struck, bases destroyed, leaders eliminated. Some will be true. Some will be exaggerated, some will be recycled footage from older conflicts. The goal is often not accuracy, it's momentum. It's getting the story into people's minds before verification can catch up. So here's the rule. In a fast war, certainty is suspicious. The louder the claim, the more you should demand proof. But even if you strip away every rumor, the economic math remains. If Hormuz is unreliable, oil carries a premium. If oil carries a premium, everything carries a premium. And if everything carries a premium, voters feel it before diplomats can fix it. Now let's talk about the internal dimension inside Iran, because that's where predictability goes to die. When a state is under heavy external pressure, it can react in ways that are hard to forecast. It can rally nationalism. It can crack down on dissent. It can attempt to project stability through rapid announcements and tight messaging. It can also fracture, because elite factions don't just compete when times are good. They compete harder when survival is on the line. Succession, politics, institutional rivalry, and fear can create a dangerous cocktail. If decision-making becomes fragmented, actions become less coordinated. And when actions become less coordinated, miscalculation becomes more likely. In other words, the scariest version of this story isn't a deliberate plan, it's an accident. One missile that hits the wrong target. One strike that causes unexpected casualties. One commander who acts without permission. One rumor that triggers a panic move. That's how escalation spirals. Now zoom back out to the international layer, because the world isn't watching passively. Gulf states want the strait open, but they also want to avoid becoming targets. Europe wants de-escalation, but it fears an inflation surge that would punish citizens and destabilize politics. Asia has perhaps the highest direct exposure because so much Gulf energy flows east, and many economies there depend on steady maritime imports. And then you have the global shipping network itself, which doesn't care about speeches. It cares about risk, profit, and liability. If risk becomes too high, routes change. Ships reroute around Africa, voyages take longer, fuel costs rise, freight rates climb. Those costs don't disappear. They get passed down the chain until they land on consumers. This is how a regional conflict can become a worldwide cost of living shock. Now, where does it go from here? There are three broad scenarios, and most outcomes are variations of these. Scenario 1 is rapid negotiation. In this path, pressure works fast. Back channels heat up, intermediaries move messages. Both sides look for language that allows an off-ramp without humiliation. The public posture stays tough, but behind the scenes, the conversation becomes practical. Safe passage, verification, phase steps, and terms that can be sold domestically as a win. If this happens, shipping resumes, the risk premium fades, and prices retreat. Not necessarily to the old normal, because the world remembers vulnerability, but enough to avoid a deeper economic wound. Scenario 2 is prolonged, managed escalation. Here, neither side chooses all-out war, but neither side backs down. Disruption comes in pulses. Transits happen, then pause. Convoys form. Insurance stays elevated. Markets stay nervous. Oil remains higher for longer. Inflation becomes stickier. Growth slows. The world doesn't collapse overnight, it erodes, quietly, expensively, and unevenly. In this scenario, governments start doing what governments always do under stress: subsidize, ration, or intervene. Those measures calm the public temporarily, but they strain budgets and distort markets. And every week that passes increases the chance of a mistake that pushes the conflict into a bigger phase. Scenario 3 is internal fracture and loss of control. This is the chaotic outcome. Pressure from outside collides with instability inside. Institutions struggle. Factions fight. Commands become inconsistent. The conflict spreads in unpredictable directions. For markets, this is the nightmare because uncertainty becomes permanent, shipping risk becomes chronic, energy premiums become structural, and the world starts planning for a more volatile decade. So how do you tell which direction we're moving? Stop listening to the loudest voice and watch the indicators that are hardest to fake. Watch shipping behavior. Are tankers transiting in steady patterns, or are they stacking up in holding areas? Watch insurance. War risk premiums are the heartbeat of maritime confidence. When they spike, commerce slows. When they stabilize, an off-ramp may be forming. Watch the physical market. If nearby barrels trade at extreme premiums, if refiners scramble for immediate supply, if LNG spot prices jump, that means the disruption is hitting reality, not just sentiment. Watch diplomatic language. Leaders signal intentions through process words. Talks, channels, framework, verification, safe navigation. When those words appear consistently, the system may be seeking a release valve. And watch whether additional corridors become contested. If disruption spreads beyond the Gulf, costs multiply fast. Rerouting adds distance and time is money in shipping. The ocean doesn't get smaller, the bill gets bigger. Now here's the bottom line. Most people live inside a set of assumptions they never think about. They assume energy moves. They assume ships arrive. They assume prices are boring. They assume global problems stay far away. A Hormuz crisis attacks those assumptions directly. It reminds the world that modern comfort rests on a network that is extremely efficient and sometimes extremely brittle. It reminds us that a handful of miles of water can influence the price of living for billions of people. If lanes reopen quickly, this moment becomes a warning shot, a lesson, a scar. If lanes remain contested, this becomes a slow burn shock that bleeds into inflation, interest rates, and politics. And if the crisis spirals, it becomes a restructuring event, one that changes trade routes, security priorities, investment decisions, and the everyday cost of running an economy. So don't let yourself get hypnotized by the most dramatic sentence you hear. Ask the practical question. What is moving? What is not moving? And how long can the world tolerate uncertainty in the place where so much energy either flows or doesn't? Because the Strait of Hormuz is not just a location, it's a test. A test of whether diplomacy can outpace panic. A test of whether deterrence still works. A test of whether the global economy has enough resilience to absorb a shock before it becomes a crisis. And right now, that test is underway. And there's a detail that almost everyone gets wrong, even people who follow this stuff. This is not only about how much oil exists, it's about how much oil can move on time, in the right direction, under contracts that assume normal transit. You can have crude sitting in storage tanks on one shore while a refinery on another shore pays a premium for a barrel that can actually arrive. You can have supply in theory and scarcity in practice at the same time. Logistics is reality, everything else is a spreadsheet fantasy. That's why you'll hear people say there are other routes. And yes, there are alternatives. Some producers have pipelines that bypass the strait. Some volumes can move west to the Red Sea or out through terminals outside the Gulf. Those options are real and they matter because they can soften a shock. But they are not a magic replacement for the full flow. They are pressure release valves, not a new heart. If the main artery tightens, the body still feels it. Then you have strategic reserves. Governments keep them for exactly this reason, to buy time, to cushion a sudden disruption so the world doesn't immediately spiral. But reserves are not infinite, and they are not designed to replace normal trade forever. They are a bridge, not a new road. And a bridge comes with a clock. If the disruption is short, reserves look brilliant. If the disruption becomes prolonged, reserves turn into a countdown that the market watches like a doomsday timer. Every release is a reminder that the situation is still abnormal. Now, let's talk about the consumer experience, because that's where geopolitics becomes personal. Most people don't track Brent or WTI. They track the price on the pump, the cost of groceries, the monthly utility bill, and the interest rate on a loan. Energy costs seep into everything, and they do it quietly at first. Gasoline climbs and commutes get more expensive. Diesel climbs and everything transported food, retail goods, building materials gets more expensive. Jet fuel climbs and travel and air cargo get more expensive. Natural gas climbs and electricity and heating get more expensive. And once those costs embed, they don't unwind instantly. Even if oil drops tomorrow, many businesses keep prices high until competition forces them down. That lag is how a short shock can leave a long shadow. Now, a quick myth to kill. Higher prices will quickly bring new supply. In textbooks, yes, price goes up, producers pump more, problem solved. In reality, spare capacity is limited. New projects take time, and geopolitical risk can freeze investment precisely when the world needs more barrels. Even when producers want to increase output, they may not be able to do it instantly. And some may be reluctant to burn through spare capacity if they think the crisis will resolve and they want to keep a cushion. So markets don't just price what exists, they price what can respond. And if response is slow, the premium stays. All of this is why Hormuz creates such a powerful feedback loop. The tighter it feels, the higher the premium. The higher the premium, the more political pressure builds. The more political pressure builds, the more each actor is tempted to take bold action to prove strength. Bold actions increase risk. Increased risk tightens Hormuz further. That's the spiral. And it's why diplomacy matters even when it looks weak. Diplomacy is not a moral gesture in this context. It's a pressure valve that prevents the feedback loop from turning into a sustained global shock. So if you're trying to stay sane while you watch this unfold, here's a simple checklist. 5 questions that cut through the noise. 1. Are major shipping firms publicly resuming normal schedules or quietly delaying departures? 2. Are insurers reducing war risk rates or adding new exclusions that make voyages practically impossible? 3. Are governments issuing transit advisories that signal confidence or warnings that signal danger? 4. Are oil and LNG physical markets tightening, meaning real buyers are paying up for immediate delivery? 5. Are credible intermediaries publicly mentioned as channels for talks, or are leaders speaking only in threats? If the answers trend toward confidence, the shock may be peaking. If the answers trend toward restriction, the shock may be building. And if the answers are mixed, then you're in the most volatile phase, when markets can swing hard on a single verified event. Now, the uncomfortable truth. The world can absorb a short disruption. It can even absorb a sharp price spike if it's brief. What it struggles to absorb is uncertainty that lasts. Because uncertainty changes behavior, companies delay investment, consumers pull back spending, governments spend more to stabilize prices. Central banks hesitate or overreact. And once behavior changes, the economy slows even if the original trigger fades. That's why the real question isn't, will the strait be perfectly closed? The real question is, will the strait feel safe enough, consistently enough for commerce to behave normally? Normal is the difference between a scary headline and a systemic event. So watch the water, yes, but also watch the human decisions behind the water. The insurers, the ship owners, the diplomats, the generals, the traders, and the politicians who will either calm the system or push it into the next phase. Because in the end, Hormuz doesn't destroy the world economy by itself. People do that when they run out of off-ramps or when they decide pride matters more than stability. And right now, the world is standing at the mouth of a narrow strait, staring at a simple reality. The modern economy is powerful, but it is not invincible. It runs on flow.